Within the United States narrative lives many people and groups that have championed the cause for liberty. One such group that truly embodied the spirit of the revolution was the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty have been depicted as brash, hot-headed ruffians, and even in the recent A&E miniseries, Sons of Liberty, they were depicted as the bad boys of the revolution. However, history tells a completely different story about these freedom fighters. A story of resourceful, intelligent men who moved in the background and harnessed the power of the public to achieve their goals. Through examination of their use of the press and public activism, their actions can be better understood as an unrestricted expression of the thoughts of intolerance of the imposing British Crown. By investigating these Sons of Liberty, one can see the voice of the people moving into action and how their actions would motivate and mobilize the colonies as a unified front preceding to the Revolutionary War. But to fully understand the Sons of Liberty, we must look at how and why they were formed. Following the end of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War in 1763, the British government took a hit financially. While this winning of the war strengthened the British hold in North America, by ridding them of a northern and southern competition, it left them with more land to defend and the need for a greater military presence than before. This became an issue because it would put strain on the colonies by just having more people in them, and then also the financial strain of keeping up such a large force that it had not done previously. This, of course, would cost money. And where does money come from but taxes? In order to alleviate the financial burden, they imposed taxes upon the colonies. Over the next several years, this would take the form of many different kinds of taxes, but none more important and inflammatory than the Stamp Act of 1765. Now, out of this particular piece of legislation comes a provocative idea in the minds of the American colonists. While it's not a new or novel idea, the necessity is calling for representation in Parliament. If they were to be taxed as British citizens, then they believe that they should have representation within Parliament. The basic premise lies in the fact that the colonists had no real voice in government. Yet, they were being taxed for revenue as opposed to just regulation of trade. This is all laid out by Joseph Thorndike's analysis of the tax laws of the time. So to sum it up, the belief was that when government invades rather than safeguards property through taxation without consent, it cancels its own legitimacy. Therefore, if the government is not legitimate, then it should not be followed. If it should not be followed, then it has to be replaced. John Adams expresses a similar sentiment, and he writes that this was the most remarkable year of his life because the Stamp Act had raised the universal resentment of the people. And this resentment, this sentiment that would be seen through the people is what would fertilize the ideals from which the Sons of Liberty would be born. Now, the Sons of Liberty, to start out with, were not an organized group. They existed more as factions within individual colonies. They began as local mob groups who protested local issues that, of course, were tied to the greater British governmental tendrils that seemed to be seeping in more and more into the economic and political life of the colonial Americans. Philip Davidson, in his article Sons of Liberty and Stamp Men, looks at this and he starts to describe the initial setup and the proactive cells that began to pop up in these colonies. These colonies that had active groups were New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Charleston, and of course Boston, probably one of the most famous sections of the Sons of Liberty. These factions or these groups were first led by mob leaders, and they were usually comprised of men who were recruited from lower classes. Often these mob leaders would hold small governmental offices, nothing of great importance or great stature, but it would also afford them a large array of people in which they could mobilize and have ready at their call. It became increasingly obvious, however, that over time that these mob leaders were answering to others and or groups of people that were kept secret. The secrecy was part of the amazing ability of them to get so much done, was because they could keep their secrecy and continue on working. In Boston, this mobilizing group, this small group that kind of worked behind the scenes to move the mobs, were known as the Loyal Nine. And within this group were several different kinds of artisans and run-of-the-mill men. Now, a name usually attached to this group was Samuel Adams. He was said to have met with them or been a temporary member of the Loyal Nine, but nothing truly sets him apart in history, in correspondence, or in any kind of documentation that he was actually set apart as a leader in the Loyal Nine. As these groups grew, and as they were urged to keep in contact with each other through correspondences, they became somewhat organized in an uneasy organization. We see this uneasy organization in the similar ways in which they protested the Stamp Act. Like I said, the Stamp Act was the most inflammatory piece that moved the Sons of Liberty into action. And while their use of the press was impressive, they bombarded with pseudonyms to newspapers, and they wrote under pseudonyms and protested what the government was doing through written word. They also became very, very well known for their public protests. They became spectaculars, really, that bordered on revolution in and of themselves. In several colonies, at the exact same time, they did some of the exact same things. And of course, this is tied to the fact that their correspondence grew within this time period. One of my favorite things that they do together is the use of the effigies of stamp men. Now, stamp men were those who implemented and kept record of the stamps. And they put them in a myriad of situations that are similar and yet different. Some were hung from trees. Some were hung in front of courthouses. Some were hung in front of the houses of the people that they were meant to look like. Some were set aflame. Some were dragged through the streets, or some had particularly inflammatory and hateful speech attached to them. For instance, in Boston, the effigy of Andrew Oliver, who was the distributor of the stamps in Massachusetts, was found hanging in a tree with a boot next to it. Now, the boot in and of itself doesn't seem very important. However, the boot was a representation of the Earl of Bute, B-U-T-E. The play on words there is obvious, who no longer was in office in England. However, he was an excellent, noticeable figure that was tied to evil, and someone who was against colonial liberties, and someone that had a history of working against the colonists. And within that boot, there was a little devil that was peeking out. Just another emphasis of how demonic, or how demonizing, or how evil they thought the empire was becoming in their taxation. In a letter to Josh Mauger, Archibald Hinshelwood writes that there was a violent spirit of opposition raised in the continent against the execution of the Stamp Act, and that the mob in Boston have carried it high against Mr. Oliver, who was a town-born child there, for his acceptance of an office in which he would have to implement this Stamp Act against his own. Archibald continues on, and he said, "They have even proceeded to some violence and burnt him in effigy. They threaten to pull down and burn the Stamp Office Row building, and that they will hold every man as infamous that shall presume to carry the Stamp Act into execution. So that is the thought Mr. Oliver will resign." This just goes to show how strong and how useful the public activism was with the Sons of Liberty. This burning of effigy, these bullying tactics, for lack of a better term, worked very well for the Sons of Liberty, and it focused their mobs. And the use of the mob was very, very important in the Sons of Liberty. Their use of the mob in public protests was a balancing act that actually rarely went awry, and mobs are very difficult to control. During several protests, minimal damage was done to innocent bystanding businesses, and the objective of each protest seemed to be reached with precision. Gordon Wood looks at the mob protests of colonial America, and he draws into focus just how peculiar they were for the time. He says that the American mobs seem to have behaved in a particularly unusual fashion, and in contrast to the violent uprisings of the 18th century Europe, they appear to hardly be mobs at all, but rather really, really organized factions or really, really organized events. He continues to say that in America, the mob stopped when it attained what it set out to do. The rioters destroyed only property, and particularly selected property, and took no or very few lives during the Revolution. Their ability to control the mob, to keep them on the straight and narrow, to keep them on a path that would have the greatest impact, is extremely important to note here. I think that without that clear-cut idea of what they're supposed to be doing and what the end game was, we would have seen a completely different revolution. Especially, we would have seen a lot different things leading up to it. This is actually seen, this whole thought of them only doing what they set out to do is seen in their near dissolution after the repealing of the Stamp Act. After it is repealed, they kind of go dormant. It has been done. What they set out to do is done. And the resurgent comes in only after the Townshend Acts are put through, and then some of them are repealed, all but one, in the Tea Act. And we once again see an uprising or resurgence of the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Tea Act would lead to one of America's most told and loved Revolutionary War stories, the Boston Tea Party. And the involvement of the Sons of Liberty only adds to the popularity of this story, the mystery, the actual goings-on and events that happen with this situation are one of these things that is ingrained into us as children in our 4th and 5th grade classrooms. But the issue with the Tea Act actually goes beyond taxation without representation. Yes, it's been part of it. It's absolutely part of it as one of the precursors. But it steps into the realm of even more of an idea of monopolization of the trade in tea. This was seen as negative. It was seen as something that could potentially put colonists out of business if the British East India Company, who had gained a monopoly on the tea and were basically able to sell it to the colonists cheaper than they had before because they were given command to go straight into the colony. But it was seen as a monopolization of trade because they could only buy from the British East India Tea Company. So their fight became one of individuality, of choice. And of course, once again, the usefulness of the mob aids the Sons of Liberty to carry out their most infamous spectacle, the Boston Tea Party. It is interesting to note here that several believe the Tea Party was a last resort. Samuel Adams, who has long been paired with the Sons of Liberty, and his precise role in the Boston Tea Party is up for debate, said at the final meeting before the Tea Party that this meeting can do nothing further to save this country. He gives up. He says, no more can we talk. No more can we publish in newspapers. No more can we do these things which we have found to be necessary and useful in the past. Talk has been exhausted, and the time for rhetoric and exposés in newspapers are past. It was time for action. After Samuel Adams' announcement, several men took up with whooping and they headed to the riverfront. Robert Middlecoff paints an excellent picture in his work, The Glorious Cause. And he says in his book that there was, of course, and Adams' words signaled what should be done. War whoops greeted his announcement, and as the crowd flooded out of the meeting house, pouring along the waterfront and backing up Griffin's Wharf were the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver lay, the last two recent arrivals, and, like the first, with tea aboard. About 50 men, dressed in an Indian manner, faces darkened, bodies wrapped in blankets, broke off from the crowd and set to work, brewing the tea in the Boston harbor. The men performed their mission with dispatch, hoisting the casks of tea on deck, smashing them open, and dumping tea over the side. The water around the ships was soon covered, and before morning some of the tea had floated as far as the Dorchester Neck. The ships themselves, not damaged. A newspaper reported a week later that a padlock belonging to the captain was actually broken, and apparently it was done by mistake because for another was soon sent to him to make up for the broken one. In all, 90,000 pounds of East Indian Company tea, valued at nearly 10,000 pounds, was destroyed. A small price, these men would have said, to pay for liberty. We see in this piece here exactly how they went about doing this and the cost of what it was. And 10,000 pounds at that time was quite a sum. However, I like the part where Middlecoff draws into attention the fact that ship was not damaged, and the one piece of the ship that was damaged, a padlock, was replaced. I think it's very funny, and it goes with Gordon Wood's assessment of the mob mentality and how the American mob was not really a mob at all. Several others commended the actions of Boston's Sons of Liberty at this time. John Adams even notes in pieces of his writings at the time that he was opposed to the parliamentary taxation of the colonies, and in several letters he even claims of the sublimity of the dumping of the tea, and crows that the people have passed the river and cut away the bridge, and that the spirit of liberty is very high in the country. That spirit of liberty would only be aloft momentarily. Soon after the coercive acts or the intolerable acts would be passed, they would be passed in order to try to bring the colonists back in line with the British Empire. However, this would prove to be the final straw with many patriots and revolutionary spirits. The movement, rhetoric, and actions of the Sons of Liberty would actually help set the stage for the Revolutionary War and the birth of a nation.